I left the house this morning, it felt like spring. I don't know what it feels like now. Not spring. This morning was spring, and all I could think was, something is very wrong here. I have never seen so little snow in Toronto in January. We don't often speak about climate change from our bima, not because it isn't real, not because it isn't true, not because we want to close our eyes and our ears and imagine that it will just fix itself somehow, but because it is hard to find a hopeful message. And rabbis and cantors are in the business of providing hope and comfort and uplift and joy wherever we can find it. But it seems immoral not to speak of it from time to time. And so tonight, when we have so many representatives of Yad, our young adult division at Holy Blossom Temple, when we are in the company of the next generation who are inheriting the problems that the previous generations created, I could only see in this week's Torah portion the story of the undoing of creation. This week and next, we read about the 10 plagues that befell Egypt. And there are more than just a few hints. There are more than just a few linguistic flashing lights in the description of the 10 plagues that come to teach us that these plagues lobbed against Egypt are tied to God's work of creation, but in the inverse. Everything comes undone in these Torah portions. The plagues are the undoing of the creation story of Genesis. Let me point out a few examples to you, and it might just blow your mind. It might just give you a new appreciation for how beautifully crafted the literature of the Hebrew Bible is. The first plague described in this week's Torah portion is about the Nile River. And keep in mind how the life-giving waters of creation began. Now we find the life-threatening water of Egypt. Thus said the eternal God, by this you shall know that I am the eternal God. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile will die, and the Nile will stink, so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile. And God said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold out your arm over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, its canals, its ponds, and its mikveh mayim, its gatherings of waters, that they may turn into blood. There shall be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in the vessels made of wood and stone. That expression, mikveh mayim, the gathering places for the water, that's exactly the same language in the creation story. In Genesis 1, God says, let the water below and the sky be gathered into one area, that the dry land may appear, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters, mikveh hamayim, God called the seas. Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. The second plague, what is it? What was it? Frogs. Okay. So these creepy, crawly things that come out of the water. It is written in our parsha this week, if you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber, your bed, the houses of your courtiers and your people and your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up upon you and on your people and on all your courtiers. But compare that to the things that swarmed in the waters in the creation story. There it is written, God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. God created sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep which the waters brought forth in swarms. Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. And God blessed them and said, be fertile and increase, Peru urevu, fill the waters of the seas. A few more examples, if I haven't yet convinced you. What was the third plague? Kinim, often translated as lice or vermin, something that creeps on the land, something unpleasant that creeps on the land, an invasion of creepy crawlers. God said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your rod, strike the dust of the earth, and it shall turn to lice throughout the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron held out his arm with the rod and struck the dust of the earth, and vermin came upon man and beast. All the dust of the earth turned to lice throughout the land of Egypt. Compared to the creepy crawlies on the land that were created originally, God said, let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, creeping things and wild beasts of every kind. And it was so. So you can see how the 10 plagues are the undoing of the creation story. And I can show you more examples. It only intensifies. There is cattle disease. There were the cattle that were created. There is hail and locusts that wipe out all the vegetation. And you can recall from the Genesis story how God created the trees of the fields and the grasses of the fields. And the language is the same, Deshe and Pri Ha'etz. There's an echoing of the creation and the destruction. Darkness, the 9th plague. Think of how in the creation story, on the first day, God created light and separated light from darkness, where in Egypt everything went dark. And then finally, the 10th plague, Makat Bechorot. In the middle of the night, the Eternal One struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. In comparison to Genesis 1, and God said, let us make a human being after our likeness, and they will rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the cattle and the whole earth and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God formed the Adam from the dust of the earth, and God blew into its nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a living being. And God said, Tov me'od, very good. When it came to the crossing of the sea, we also see an echo of the Genesis story. The same words of Mayim and Yabasha, the waters that swelled at the sea, and the dry land that appeared when the sea was split. Similarly, in the creation story, God divides waters from waters, not on the horizontal plane, but the vertical plane. God separates the skies, the waters of the heavens from the waters down below. And God called the gathering of the waters seas, and it was also good. Compared to Moses held out his arm over the sea, God drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. So what does this teach us? Not only that the authors of our sacred text were inspired by the divine, so much so that they could craft such beautiful literature with all kinds of hints for us to discover, but also that the creation story of Genesis was written by our ancestors in such a way as to stir up wonder and awe for God's design, which is good, ki tov. And the telling of the 10 plagues is written by our ancestors to stir up in us terror and awe for just how quickly God's creation can unravel, just how severely humanity can suffer when creation comes undone. Tomorrow morning, we will announce the coming of the new moon, the month of Shvat, colored by the minor festival of Tu B'Shvat, when the almond buds blossom and bloom in Israel and the natural world wakes up from its hibernation. May we and our governments and the industries which have real power to make a real impact be awake to the fact that our world and all it contains is fragile, and that God is watching, weeping, waiting for us not to take anything for granted, not to squander any opportunity to protect this wonderful world. Shabbat Shalom. Do you want to say a word?